I'm Paul Reitemeyer. I'm the chair of the Human Research Review Committee here at Grand Valley. I've been chair for about 6 years. And I want to welcome you all to come. As you know, the federal government Office of Human Research Protections under the Department of Health and Human Services proposed last month on making some sweeping fundamental changes to the Code of Federal Regulations, in particular those speaking to protections for persons involved in research that involve living human subjects. And today, all I'm going to do is go through in outline form the basic meat of what those proposed new changes are and facilitate a discussion and Q&A as we go along, and then at the end. There's quite a bit of information. A lot of this is very dramatic, and we have absolutely no way of knowing how much of it will be accepted, and if it is accepted, when it will be implemented. We generally, based on past experience with this sort of thing, can anticipate at least a year before implementation, maybe more. But things change in Washington, and maybe they're on a fast track and they've got a lot of people lined up for this already. We just don't know. But there is a comment period that just this morning was extended by 30 days to now end on October 26th. All comments received by then will be posted as submitted without editing on a government website, and they'll all be considered by the Office of Human Research Protections, and then they will use those comments and feedback to revise the proposed new rule and issue then another version of the rule. There will be a second comment period, I'll talk about that in a minute, and then they'll issue a final rule, and the final rule will have an effective date, and then they usually have a delayed compliance date in addition. So they say, here's the new rules, and this is the date in the future by which you must be compliant with these new rules. Here's the process. The advanced notice of a proposed new rulemaking came out in July. This is the comment period. It's now 90 days. Then they will issue a notice of proposed rulemaking. That'll be a slightly revised version of what we're talking about today, or maybe a radically revised, we don't know. There'll be another comment period, length is unspecified, and then they'll issue a final rule. And they typically also will take some comments on the final rule, but the further down this line it gets, the more resistant to change the feds tend to be. Okay. Sections of the advanced notice of proposed new rule making, that's what the acronym is, I'm just going to call it the new rules. The first section is about background, why and why now. Sections 2 through 8 are the meat of the notice, and section 9 is the request for information and comment from everybody and how to do that. Okay. History of the regulations, you know about World War II, it was in all the papers. All the research regulations that came out of those. It's been 20 years since the Common Rule has been revised. Now, it was originally issued in the 70s. It was then revised in 1991 when 14 different federal agencies got together and agreed to the same language and the same numbering system for the rules. And that's now called the Common Rule. Since then, guidance has come out quite frequently from the Office of Human Research Protections, but it's not regulatory, it's not required, it is guidance. So this is the first time in 20 years that the feds themselves, in response to a hue and cry from the researching community, have proposed to revise the rules, and they've made some pretty dramatic suggestions. The reason is because there's more research done now than there was 20 years ago. There's a wide variety of the kinds of sites where things are done in the community and community health centers and others. 20 years ago, 80% of all of the clinical research done in the United States was done under academic medical center control. 20% was done under pharmaceutical control. That, in the last 20 years, has completely reversed. Now only 20% of the research is done under academic health centers. The majority of it is done under pharmaceutical control and in community-based research and international research. Multi-site research, increasingly, in order to be competitive and to have large databases, collaborators, researchers from different institutions agree to do the same study at multiple sites. But because of the way the regulations are written, you'll have to go through an IRB review and approval at each of those sites. One of the proposals is get rid of that. Have one IRB review. In fact, make that law. You can only have one IRB review by regulation. Now, you could independently have more than that if you wanted, but it wouldn't be because it was required by the regulations. And then the different focus in research. We now see a huge increase in genetics-based research, particularly with biospecimens and with data sets and very large data sets. So the regulation revisions that they're proposing speak to all of those concerns. They have identified 7. Inadequate calibration of risk to type of review. As you know, there are exempt review procedures, expedited review procedures, and full board review procedures. The rules were originally written for everything to be full board, and then they decided, no, that's nuts. You don't need to have that many people meeting all together to review a survey research. So they invented 6 categories that they said were exempt from the regulations. It is human subjects research, but the Code of Federal Regulations do not apply to those. They're exempt. So you don't need a consent form, you don't need data security measures, you don't need a lot of things that you would need if they were under the regulations. And that lasted for about 12 years. And then there was a large hue and cry from the researcher community, and they said, look, there's stuff that is not exempt but doesn't require a full board review. Isn't there another mechanism we can use to expedite the review and approval of those procedures? And OHARP came out and said yes, and they invented 9 categories that would still come under the full set of the Code of Federal Regulations, but didn't require a convened meeting of the full board. One guy could do it. The IRB chair or somebody the IRB chair designated could do it if they were well versed and trained in applying the regulations. And so that's the situation that we've got now. 6 categories of exempt review, 9 categories of expedited review, and everything else goes to full board, including everything that's greater than minimal risk. A federal-wide assurance, just to remind those of you who don't know what that is a promise that's made by the institution, not by the IRB, but by the university itself, under the signature of the provost, that says to the federal government essentially 3 things. We know that there are rules and regulations. We agree to follow them, and if anybody breaks them, we will take corrective measures and implement corrective actions and implement preventive measures so they don't occur in the future. That's basically it. When you make that assurance, what you have to do if you're going to receive any federal money for research for the institution for any reason, you have to agree to the provisions of the Common Rule, which is Subpart A, under the particular provisions of the Code of Federal Regulations. All of these proposed revisions from the feds only address the Common Rule. None of them address the subparts, which are additional protections for identified vulnerable populations of pregnant women and fetuses, prisoners, and minors. So none of these revisions affect any of those additional protections. The other thing that is part of the federal-wide assurance is a decision that you're asked to make. Are you assuring the federal government that all of the research that's done will be compliant with the federal regulations only if it's federally funded? Or does that assurance apply to all research, regardless of funding? And you have a choice. You can say only federally funded or all research. One of the proposed revisions is to eliminate that choice and to say, if you get $1 from the federal government for human subjects research to anybody in your institution, then all of the research at that institution must be compliant with the federal regulations. So you no longer have the choice of saying this assurance only extends to federally funded research. It has to extend to all research. Okay? So those are just a couple of the high points. Just so you know, these subparts are optional in the federal regulation in your FWA. You can choose which box to check, as they say. Previously, a lot of places used to check all sources of funding, all research will be compliant with the regs, and of course we'll add all of these provisions for the subparts. Increasingly, institutions are moving away from that degree of assurance. Mostly it has to do with the liability exposure to federal regulators coming in for audit procedures. And so Grand Valley has joined that emerging movement, and we have unchecked the box of the separate protections, and we have said it will only apply to federally supported research. Now, this is important that you understand the distinction here. That's what we said in our assurance, our contractual agreement with the federal government. We're only going to assure that these protections are provided for the Common Rule, which is competent adults, and for federally funded studies. In fact, in practice, we extend those protections in our review procedures to everybody regardless of funding. And we include almost all of these provisions. There's one that we disagree with, and so we don't provide that one. But in practice, what we do is more than what we promise we're going to do. Okay? So we really do take the moral high ground. We just don't promise the feds that we're going to. Does that make sense? Okay. So here's the reason that they got concerned the rules were outdated. There's inadequate calibration of risk to type of review. What a lot of people don't understand is that exempt categories are not limited by risk. You can have greater than minimal risk studies and it still qualify for exempt. The only limitation about minimum risk is for the expedited categories, those 9. In order to be eligible for expedited review, it cannot be any greater than minimal risk research. And of course, full board review can be any level of risk, including life-threatening. But that's not an easy fit between the different kinds of research in these 3 currently described breakouts. And so one of the proposals is to change this quite a bit. There's inefficiencies of multiple IRB review for multi-site research. Their response is, don't do it. Just do it once. IRBs have to agree who's going to be the IRB of record and do the review and approval, and then everybody else back off and get out of the researcher's way. Questions about informed consent, lots of complaints, particularly with complex oncology studies and other clinical studies. We now see 20, 30, 40-page consent forms, generally considered to be ridiculous and not helpful, not protective. And so they are proposing that we develop some standardized templates with some standardized boilerplate language, require some things to be included in a consent form, require that other things be excluded from a consent form, and provide boilerplate language in some circumstances, all of which would be a good move forward if they use the right language. And of course, they're not proposing any specifics yet, but they're saying, do you think this is the right direction we should go? Changes in the nature of risks and benefits in research, particularly as that pertains to research involving genetic information, biospecimens, and data sets with personally identifiable sensitive information. The monitoring and evaluation of the current system seems to be overdone. They want to reduce the amount of monitoring and reduce the amount of evaluation within the system for what they consider to be no-risk research. All research subjects are not protected, some are excluded, and there's a lack of regulatory harmonization, which is a nice way of saying the federal agencies have different rules, and they really shouldn't. They should all agree on what rules apply to research and the language used to describe those rules. Okay.
Paul, can I ask a question? So for the multi-site, you know how right now, like, I have a research project up in Muskegon, so it had to go to the Mercy Health Partners IRB approval and also to Grand Valley. Would that then change? And there would have to be some sort of agreement between the different IRBs?
Right. In fact, the proposal, and we'll get into this a little bit later, the proposal is as about as strongly worded as you could imagine. They say we will mandate one IRB review.
But then which one?
They don't specify how you resolve that. Okay. There is a nice article about 6 pages long or so that was published the day before the proposed new rules came out. It was written by 2 of the authors on the task force that developed the new rules. One is Ezekiel Manuel. He used to be the director of the Center for Bioethics in the National Institute of Health. He's now a vice president at the University of Pennsylvania. That takes effect actually September 1st. The other one is Jerry Menikoff, who's an MD, PhD, and he is the director of the Office of Human Research Protections within the Department of Health and Human Services. And this article, which I recommend to you, and we will have a PDF of that again on our website by the end of the week, explains the rationale behind all of it. So I won't spend time to do it. But basically they said, we've got a variety of bureaucratic procedures that seem to do little to protect research participants but consume substantial resources, and what they left off was, and annoy the hell out of researchers. So that's what they're trying to address. Current regulations could be doing a significantly better job in protecting research subjects, and all we got to do is tweak the rules and that will happen. Next slide.